You're safe in your bed, lights off, right? Now, imagine being alone in a hospital at 3 a.m., the only sounds the distant hum of machines and a chilling whisper from an empty hall. Turn off those lights, and prepare to hear what night shift nurses truly encounter when the world is asleep. Story 1, The Midnight Caller. This happened to me in the fall of 2019, when I was working nights at St. Jude's Memorial, a smaller community hospital just off Highway 17, nestled in the quiet town of Willow Creek. My shifts ran from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., a 12-hour marathon that often felt like living in a different dimension. The quiet of the night shift suited me. There was a certain peace in the hushed corridors, a sense of shared camaraderie among the skeleton crew of nurses, aides, and doctors. Most nights were routine, medication rounds, monitoring vitals, comforting worried families who lingered too long, and the occasional emergency that shattered the calm. It was predictable, mundane even, and I liked it that way. I'd usually take my breaks in the dimly lit staff lounge, scrolling through my phone or chatting quietly with Nurse Brenda, who always had a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a story to tell. We shared the quiet rhythms of the hospital at rest. The third floor, where I primarily worked, was mostly for long-term care and recovery. The patients were often elderly, some lucid and chatty, others lost in their own worlds. It felt more like a specialized hotel than a typical hospital ward. One of our long-term patients was Mrs. Gable, a sweet, frail woman in her late 80s, always in room 217. She had been with us for months, battling a complex series of health issues, and despite her frailty, she had a spark, a gentle humor that made her a favorite among the staff. Her room was on the far end of the hall, near the fire exit, and her call bell was a frequent, but always polite, summons. She'd often just want a glass of water, or for us to adjust her blanket, a comforting, familiar presence. Then, one Tuesday night, Mrs. Gable passed away peacefully in her sleep. It was sad, as it always is, but also a quiet release for her. We followed the usual procedures, contacting her family, and preparing the room. By the time my shift ended, Mrs. Gable's belongings had been packed, the room thoroughly cleaned, and the bed stripped. It was standard protocol, ready for a new patient, although typically rooms would stay empty for a night or two after a patient passed. The next night, I was at the nurse's station, charting notes around 2 a.m. The hospital was utterly silent, save for the distant hum of the ventilation system. Suddenly, the distinct, familiar sound of a call bell chimed, echoing in the quiet. I glanced up at the panel. Room 217. My blood ran a little cold, just for a second. Mrs. Gable's room. But that was impossible, the room was empty, meticulously cleaned. I dismissed it as a glitch, faulty wiring in an old building. Sometimes the system would act up, especially late at night. I pressed the button to cancel the alarm, a quick, practiced motion. But 10 minutes later, it chimed again. Room 217. A prickle of unease started to spread. I walked down the hall, peeking into the room. It was dark, silent, and empty. I even checked the call button itself on the wall by the bed, just in case a cleaner had accidentally bumped it, though that was unlikely. Nothing seemed amiss. I shrugged it off as tired nerves. The next night, the call bell from 217 rang again, around 3:15 a.m. This time, it wasn't just a single chime, it was two short, sharp rings, almost like an urgent request. My heart skipped a beat. I looked at Brenda, who was also on duty. Her eyes met mine, wide and a little wary. "Old building," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew as well as I did that these systems were robust. Over the next few shifts, it became a regular occurrence. Always 217. Always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Sometimes just a single, lonely chime, other times a persistent, demanding sequence of rings. The other nurses started making nervous jokes. Looks like Mrs. Gable's still got some requests. The laughter felt brittle, forced. We all knew, deep down, it wasn't a joke. Maintenance had been called repeatedly. They checked the wiring, replaced components, ran diagnostics. Every time, they reported the system was perfectly fine. No faults found. But the bell kept ringing. I started feeling a distinct cold spot whenever I walked past room 217, even in the warmth of the hospital. A chill that wasn't from a draft, but seemed to emanate from the very air. One particularly quiet night, I distinctly caught a faint, earthy smell lingering around the doorway of 217. It was subtle, like damp soil after a rain, utterly out of place amidst the antiseptic tang of the hospital. I tried to rationalize it, maybe someone tracked in dirt, a strange cleaning product. But the smell was too specific, too raw. It was unnerving, and I found myself hurrying past the room more often than not. The call bell rang again, loud and clear, pulling me from my thoughts. It was just past 3 a.m. Brenda was in the break room, and I was alone at the station. This time, the ringing was relentless, not stopping when I hit the reset button. It was no longer just a chime, it was a demand, an insistence. I felt a surge of irrational anger, mixed with a chilling dread. This had to stop. I grabbed my flashlight, a heavy-duty model I kept for power outages. Ignoring the cold knot in my stomach, I walked slowly down the long, silent corridor towards room 217. The door was slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, shining my light around the empty space. The room was cold, far colder than the hallway, and the air was thick, heavy, like static before a storm. The call bell unit was at the head of the bed, a small gray box with a red button. It was quiet now, but the light on the wall panel above the door was still blinking red, indicating an active call. I stepped further in, forcing myself to be methodical. This was just a faulty wire, a loose connection. I knelt beside the bed, shining the light on the bell unit, examining the cord that snaked into the wall. My fingers traced the plastic, searching for any break or fraying. Nothing. It seemed perfectly intact. I pressed the red button, then released it, trying to trigger a response, to understand. That's when I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth against my neck, followed by a rush of frigid air. Then, the undeniable sound of labored breathing right behind me. Shallow, ragged, as if struggling for air. The smell of damp earth was suddenly overwhelming, filling my nostrils, making me gag. Every hair on my body stood on end. My mind screamed, but my body froze, paralyzed by absolute terror. I whirled around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty. But as I spun, the call bell unit, still in my hand, suddenly emitted a sharp, clear ring. Not a system fault. Not a flicker. It was a definite, deliberate press. I dropped the unit with a cry, stumbling back. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a call. And something was there, in that empty room, with me. Mrs. Gable was calling, still calling. I fled the room, slamming the door shut behind me, the cold knot in my stomach now a solid, aching mass. I didn't stop to reset the alarm from the station. I just needed to be away, needed to breathe. I spent the rest of that shift huddled with Brenda, fabricating a story about being startled by a dropped supply cart. She gave me a knowing look, but didn't press. The next few nights, I avoided room 217. I'd cancel the call from the station, my finger trembling each time. The bell still rang, less frequently now, but with a chilling patience. It felt like it was waiting for me. Just waiting. A silent, spectral presence, listening, watching. It knew my routine. Then came the worst night. It was late again, past 3 a.m. Brenda was doing rounds on another floor, leaving me alone at the nurse's station. The hospital was a tomb. The call bell from 217 rang. It wasn't the usual quick chime. It was a slow, deliberate, drawn-out ding, echoing down the empty hall, each reverberation chilling me to the bone. I stared at the panel, my hand frozen above the reset button. I couldn't press it. I just couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the door of 217. It was slightly ajar, just a hairline crack, reflecting the emergency exit light across the hall. I remembered leaving it that way earlier, after a quick, nervous check. The bell dinged again. A long, mournful sound. Then, slowly, infinitesimally slowly, the crack in the door began to narrow. It was moving. From within. The heavy, fire-rated door to room 217 was slowly, silently, closing itself. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move. My muscles had seized, locked in a paralysis of pure, unadulterated fear. My eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on that closing sliver of darkness. As the gap between the door and the frame narrowed to a whisper-thin line, a sound finally escaped the room. It was a low, choked gasp, a strained utterance. A whisper. Barely audible, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. And it was Mrs. Gable's voice. Frail, raspy, exactly as I remembered it. "Sarah, help me," the words hung in the air, heavy with desperation and a chilling, ancient sorrow. My blood turned to ice in my veins. Then, with a soft click, the door shut completely. The red light on the panel for 217 went dark. The call bell was silent. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It was absolute, suffocating. I didn't reset the alarm. I just stood there, shaking uncontrollably, for what felt like an eternity. I didn't finish that shift. I called Brenda, babbling incoherently about feeling sick. She found me huddled in the break room, tears streaming down my face. I requested a transfer the very next day, citing family emergencies, anything to get out. I never stepped foot in St. Jude's Memorial again. I couldn't. But the memory, the sound, the whisper, it stayed. Sometimes, late at night, in the profound silence of my own home, I swear I hear a faint, distant ding. And a choked, desperate whisper, carried on a sudden, cold draft, just at the edge of my hearing. It didn't just haunt that room. It was waiting. And it wanted me. If you ever work a night shift, and hear a call that shouldn't be answered, a voice calling your name from an empty room, don't you ever, ever go. Story 2, The Unlisted Patient. This happened to me in the fall of 2019, when I was working nights at St. Jude's Regional Hospital in Oak Haven. It was a pretty typical small-town hospital, just off Route 17, nothing fancy, but the staff were good people. My shift was usually 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., a full 12 hours of everything from twisted ankles to genuine emergencies. Most nights in the ER were a weird mix of adrenaline and long stretches of quiet boredom. You learn to appreciate those quiet moments, the hum of the machines, the shared knowing glances with the other nurses and doctors as the clock slowly ticked towards dawn. We were a tight-knit crew, relying on each other through the strange, lonely hours when most of the world was asleep. The night shift has its own rhythm, a different kind of energy than the day. There's a certain stillness that settles over the hospital after midnight, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the murmur of hushed conversations at the nurse's station. It felt like a small, self-contained world, separate from everything else. It could be peaceful, almost meditative at times, especially when a quiet night blessed us. I'd often be stationed at the main triage desk, welcoming patients or, more often at those late hours, just keeping an eye on the waiting room. It was usually empty after about 2 a.m., save for the occasional homeless person seeking shelter or a family member dozing off while waiting for news. It wasn't the most glamorous part of the job, but it was essential, the front line of care. We had a pretty strict protocol for anyone who came in. Every single person had to be checked into the system, get a wristband, and have their basic info recorded. It was for safety, for tracking, for billing, for everything. No one just sat in the waiting room without being processed, not for long anyway. That was just how an ER worked, a fundamental rule of the house. I loved my job, truly. It was demanding, sure, but also incredibly rewarding. Helping people, making a difference in what might be the worst moment of their lives, there's nothing quite like it. Even the repetitive tasks, the endless charting, the constant vigilance, it all contributed to the feeling of doing something important. It grounded me, gave me purpose. It was around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, about a month into my night shift rotation, when I first saw him. He was sitting in one of the far chairs in the waiting room, near the large window that looked out onto the empty parking lot. An old man, probably in his late 70s or early 80s, dressed in an old-fashioned, somewhat ill-fitting suit, a muted gray that seemed to absorb all light. He was remarkably still, almost unnervingly so. No fidgeting, no phone, no book, just sitting there, hands clasped over a worn walking stick. I remember thinking, poor guy, must be waiting for someone, or maybe he just got dropped off and is too tired to check in properly. I made a mental note to get to him once I finished charting a recent discharge. But the discharge took longer than expected. A minor complication, a last-minute instruction for the family. By the time I looked up again, maybe 15 minutes later, he was gone. I shrugged it off. Probably just went to the restroom or finally got called back by one of the doctors. No big deal, these things happen. People move around. A few nights later, around the same time, 3 a.m. again, there he was. Same chair, same suit, same incredible stillness. This time, I went through the mental checklist quicker. Did I miss a check-in? A family member? I quickly scanned the current patient list, glanced at the waiting list on the monitor. Nothing. He wasn't in our system. I figured he must have just come in, maybe sat down before approaching the desk. I was about to stand up and walk over, offer him a clipboard, when the next set of call lights lit up. A code blew in room 3, followed by an urgent request for supplies from another nurse. The ER was suddenly alive, bustling with controlled chaos. By the time the immediate emergency was dealt with and the initial surge of adrenaline subsided, the waiting room was, once again, empty. No old man. I remember a faint prickle of unease then, a tiny seed of something not quite right. Twice now, gone without a trace, and never in the system. But the ER gets weird at night, I told myself to focus on the living. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Every few nights, usually between 2:45 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., the old man would be there. Always in that specific chair. Always silent. Always unlisted. He never seemed to move, never coughed, never so much as shifted his weight. It was like he was a statue, just part of the furniture, but undeniably human. He had a gaunt face, skin like old parchment stretched over sharp bone, and his eyes were the most unsettling part. Dark, sunken, and they seemed to stare straight ahead, never at me, never at anything specific, but somehow, they felt like they saw everything. They held an ancient sorrow, a depth that felt wrong for a passing stranger. I started checking the system more diligently whenever I saw him. Our main computer, the backup, even the old paper log from previous shifts, just to be sure. But his name, his face, never appeared anywhere. It was as if he was entirely invisible to our digital records, a ghost in the machine of our hospital. One night, the hospital felt particularly cold, even for late fall. The AC was acting up, and drafts seemed to swirl through the corridors. I walked past the waiting room and saw him again. This time, as I passed, I felt an intense, sudden chill that wasn't just the AC. It was a deep, bone-aching cold that seemed to emanate directly from him. My skin crawled, and the hair on my arms stood on end. My rational mind screamed, just a draft, but my body reacted before my brain could process it. A faint, almost imperceptible scent hit me too, like damp earth and something vaguely metallic. It was fleeting, gone as soon as I walked a few steps past the waiting room entrance. I turned back quickly, a sudden, desperate urge to confront him, to demand why he was here. But the chair was empty again. Just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, the rows of sterile chairs, and the large, reflective window showing only my own startled face. The waiting room was as it always was at this hour, devoid of life. The pattern had become so ingrained that I'd unconsciously brace myself around 2:45 a.m. on certain nights, a subtle tension settling in my shoulders. I knew he'd be there. My colleagues never seemed to notice him, or if they did, they never mentioned it. I once pointed vaguely towards the chair he occupied, asking, "Who's that gentleman?" But the other nurse just looked at me blankly and said, "What gentleman, Mark? Waiting room's empty." I started questioning my own sanity. Was I imagining him? Was it sleep deprivation playing tricks on my eyes? I was a professional, a nurse, I couldn't afford to be hallucinating. But the feeling of his presence, the profound stillness, the unlisted nature of him, it all felt too real to dismiss as just fatigue or a trick of the light. He was there. And he was getting under my skin. One particularly long night, after a series of difficult cases, my patience and my rationalizations wore thin. It was 3:05 a.m. I looked up from my charting, and there he was, sitting in his usual spot, utterly motionless. His dark eyes, which usually stared straight ahead, seemed to fixate on the main entrance doors this time, a cold, unwavering gaze. A surge of frustration and a deeper, colder dread washed over me. This was wrong. This was against every rule, every protocol, every basic understanding of how a hospital worked. He was a patient, or he wasn't. He was a person, or he was something else. I couldn't just keep ignoring him, pretending he wasn't there, or worse, pretending I wasn't seeing him. I slammed my pen down, the sharp click echoing in the quiet reception area. "All right," I muttered to myself, pushing back my chair. "That's it. I'm going to talk to him. If he's a patient, he needs help. If he's not, he needs to leave." My heart was thumping, a mix of annoyance and a strange, cold fear I couldn't quite name. I took a deep breath, walked around the triage desk, and started towards the waiting room. My steps felt heavy, amplified by the silent hospital. As I approached the double doors leading into the waiting area, I focused on the old man, preparing my words. "Sir, can I help you? Have you checked in?" But as I stepped through the doors, my gaze still fixed on that chair, it was empty. Utterly, completely empty. The waiting room was pristine, the chairs perfectly aligned, the magazines untouched. It was as if he had never been there at all. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, scanning the corners, the restrooms, even the emergency exit. Nothing. My mind reeled. I had just seen him. Just moments ago. I even saw his eyes. He couldn't have vanished that quickly. I ran back to the triage desk, pulling up the system again, frantically typing in random names, searching for elderly male, unidentified. Every search came back empty. Every single one. He was literally unlisted. A cold, creeping terror began to bloom in my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. This wasn't sleep deprivation. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was impossible. I stumbled back towards the waiting room, my eyes wide, desperately searching for any sign, any shred of evidence that he had been there. My gaze swept over the large glass doors that led from the main waiting room back into the reception area, the same doors I had just walked through. And then I saw it. High up on the inside of the glass, about 6 feet from the floor, was a dark, almost greasy handprint. It was faint but undeniable, the distinct impression of a withered, bony hand. It was placed far too high for an elderly man to reach comfortably, especially from a seated position, and certainly too high for him to have made it casually. More terrifying still, it was on the inside of the glass, facing inwards, towards the ER. As if someone had pressed their hand against the glass from the other side, from within the waiting room, and then just disappeared. The waiting room was on the other side of those doors. There was no way for someone to press their hand on the inside of the glass and then vanish without a trace, unless they had gone through the wall. My blood ran cold. The image of those dark, unsettling eyes, fixed on those doors just moments before, flashed in my mind. He wasn't just unlisted, he wasn't just leaving. He was permeating. A breath, cold as ice, ghosted across the back of my neck. My body froze. Every nerve ending screamed. I spun around, but nothing was there. Just the empty, fluorescent-lit corridor, stretching out into sterile silence. The scent of damp earth, metallic and faint, was suddenly stronger, clinging to the air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. I felt a pressure, heavy and unseen, pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled back to the desk, collapsing into my chair, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't even pick up my pen. The handprint on the glass seemed to pulsate in my peripheral vision. From that night on, the ER felt different. The quiet hum was no longer peaceful, it was a prelude to something sinister. The shadows in the corners of my vision seemed to deepen, to coalesce into vague shapes. I felt a constant, prickling sensation on my skin, like unseen eyes were always on me, always observing. I started seeing him in reflections. Not directly, never face to face. Just a fleeting glimpse in the polished surface of the monitors, in the gleam of the stainless steel medical equipment, even in the glass of the ER doors as I walked past. A gaunt, sorrowful face, dark, hollow eyes staring directly at me, always gone the instant I turned my head. The cold followed me. Not just in the hospital, but everywhere. I'd be walking down the street, feeling the warmth of the sun, and suddenly a pocket of icy air would envelop me, chilling me to the bone. And with it, the faint, sickening smell of damp earth. It was a constant reminder, a chilling promise. My shifts became a waking nightmare. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see him. Every time a door creaked, I held my breath. I started losing sleep, haunted by his unsettling gaze, the silent judgment in those dark eyes. The hospital, once a place of purpose, became a cage. I quit. I couldn't take it anymore. I gave my 2 weeks' notice, packed my bags, and moved to another town, took a job at a different hospital, hoping to escape the lingering presence. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and trauma. But deep down, I knew. It followed me. The cold breath still touches my neck when I'm alone in a quiet room. I still catch glimpses of his face in the corner of my vision, in the darkened glass of my bedroom window at night. His eyes are always there, watching me, an eternal, silent patient. I never see him directly. He never speaks. He just watches, an uninvited, unlisted observer in my life, a terrifying specter born from the sterile quiet of a hospital waiting room. I don't know what he wants, or why he chose me. All I know is that he's always there, just out of sight, waiting. And if you ever work a night shift, and you see an old man sitting perfectly still in the waiting room at 3 a.m., unlisted and unseen by everyone else, don't ask about him. Don't break the rules. Because if you do, he might just decide to follow you home, and then, like me, you'll never truly be alone again.